Okay, so we are back with Kang, Only Myself Left to Conquer Part 4. God, I love this story. Okay, so where we left off in the last video is that basically Nathaniel had been really sent to the 40th century. Now, there's a big difference here in terms of the origin of Kang as we know it and the origin of Kang as it's being retold here. So one of the things that goes on here, and it's really kind of Marvel giving us that older origin in a familiar way, but changing it up. So in Earth, in the 40th century, as the way that you're seeing this play out, where it's quote unquote Rama-tut who ends up in the 40th century, that's technically accurate. That's the way it played out in comics originally when it came to Kang the Conqueror. The difference here is that this version of Rama-tut is not the same as the way it was originally done in Marvel Comics, hence the reason why we're getting this change in origin. That Rama-tut was the tried and true Kang, operating under the guise of Rama-tut. He was ultimately defeated by the Fantastic Four, fled back to his era, ended up in the 40th century, and so in the way the comics were originally told, it was basically a different version of Rama-tut than the one that we see here, right? Nathaniel, his motivation for why he did what he did when he was Rama-tut was totally different. Him operating as Rama-tut here now in the 40th century is different. But again, it's Marvel basically solidifying that no matter what Nathaniel does, he will always become Kang, and he'll always follow the path of the person that ends up becoming Kang. That is unavoidable and there's no way to escape it. The way we know this is that when he shows up here, what he finds himself in is basically a war-torn territory. Now, one of the big differences here is that in the original stories, the way it was told by Rama-tut, right? So Avengers 269, Captain America Annual number 11, Ravonna Renslayer didn't exist, or at least she wasn't there when he appeared in the 40th century, not in the way that she is here. So again, it's Marvel just kind of shifting things around and really retelling the origin of Ravonna, which really kind of begs the question, is Kang Volume 1 a retelling of Kang's origin or a reworking of Ravonna? Right? Like, if you had to pick one as the main focus of the story, which one would it be? I mean, technically it's both, but which one does it lean more towards, I guess, is the more accurate question to ask. But when he shows up here, of course, immediately being met by Ravonna, the whole idea behind life in this future is that it's very harsh, right? It is a very harsh and just a battle-hardened life. And more often than not in Marvel Comics, that's how the future is depicted to us. It's given to us in different ways, but the future is shown as a very hard and bleak and dark place, right? Days of Future Past, the era of Apocalypse in the far-flung future, right, when Apocalypse rules the world, this era of Kang, like all these different things, right? It's a very harsh and difficult place to be in, right? New Canaanites versus the Chosen or the Clan of Kaba or whatever it is. It's always that kind of thing, right? So it's really interesting to see that Marvel sort of keeps this maintained. But against these forces, what you have here is Ravonna Renslayer leading, by all standards of measurement, a primitive race for the most part. That there are weapons and arms and armament here, but because of the fact that society as it existed at the time had effectively collapsed, these arms and armament are beyond Ravonna Renslayer and her people's ability to understand. They can use them to a degree, but they can't use them to their fullest potential. And so what's really cool is that as the two of them fight together, much like what we saw in their initial appearances in ancient Egypt, they fall in love just like they did before. That their love is born and bred in conflict just like it was before. And the two of them working as a group face off against these barbarian hordes just like they did before. The big difference here though is that what you have is this point where once these forces are defeated, again, though the world's not saved, so to speak, it's just this kind of immediate battle, that what you have is that with these forces essentially defeated, that Nathaniel tells Ravonna, like you're amazing and I love you. The thing about this though is that he always speaks of a time in which they'd known each other in the past. She doesn't know him. As far as she's concerned, she's never met him. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to kind of continue on the life they could have had with a person who knows nothing of that life, right? As far as she's concerned and the way that she feels, he feels like he's losing her and he's forcing himself on her, and she's rebuking him in that way, right? I mean, she's growing to care about him, but he's basically moving too hard too fast. And as a result of that, he basically tells her, like, we can leave this place, right? Like together we can leave this life behind and we can go to a place where we can live a glorious life. And when he gives her that revelation, she immediately turns against it. Now, there's a few different reasons as to why she turns against it and turns against him. The first is because this is the only life she knows. It's the only life that she's even willing to accept. She can't imagine a life where there is no such thing as conflict or war or anything along those lines. But the bigger idea behind this is that because of the life that she's lived, she's grown to become ridiculously independent and doesn't see herself as somebody that can be claimed by any person. And the idea of Nathaniel showing up here using what is in effect an archaic standard of love and connection and saying that, like, you're my girl. We knew each other in the past, right? You don't know me now, but you can know me again. I'm gonna take you away from this place. It almost puts her in a feeling of being subservient, which is something that she immediately regrets. And so in doing so, that's what she says, like, you would tell me that you knew me in the past, right? She says, all this power that you have, you used to claim me as you claimed this woman that you loved, except that she is not me, and I am not yours. I belong to myself. And the moment that we've made, this moment we've had here, will be our last. You will never see me again. And she leaves. And so in essence, and that's what's kind of cool here, is that the way Ravonna Renslayer is depicted here, these different instances where she appears in the life of Nathaniel and then he loses her, that's designed to mirror the appearances of Ravonna Renslayer in the life of Kang the Conqueror. The difference is that in those lives, it was usually her being betrayed and her being killed in front of Kang or something along those lines. But regardless, no matter how the circumstance played out, it was each one of them losing the woman they loved. And in losing the woman they loved, ultimately, where Kang saw that as a weakness, Nathaniel sees it as how it is that he becomes king. And so that's why he says, he kind of reiterates the words that were told to him by Kang, never love. And he says as if it were a choice. And then he just kind of steps into everything, right? He accepts his role and he says, fine, if the choice was to be mine between a heart pierced by her gaze and one hardened against her, then I would choose conquest. Like, in effect, he's tired of losing her, right? He's tired of experiencing all this loss and all this pain over and over and over again. And so what he says is, my army was unwashed, untrained, savage, and cruel. But one fact is true throughout time. Slaves will become slavers when given a chance to hold the whip. And he says, Ravonna was incorrect. My mind was my greatest tool, for the weapons of war left behind by those magic fools in her stories were made of the very technology I had trained to repair in those long and listless childhood days. Complexity had worn on me. He says, I wished for something simple, and so I offered all the simplest choice. Join me or die. Many chose death. And so what this means is that he goes forward literally as a conqueror, that he starts to build this suit up for himself that basically looks like the suit of Kang the Conqueror, that much like Kang the Conqueror, he starts to conquer the world. And then once he gets bored conquering Earth, he sets his sights out on the entirety of the galaxy itself, right? And then the universe. And over and over and over again, taking his forces with him, he conquers everyone. And it's so cool because he says, my 100-year conquest had begun. He says, what had once seemed so distant, so esoteric, so impossibly vast was now within reach. I needed only wait and watch the 40th century fall before me. But I was not a man of patience, and with my time ship reforged, all of reality awaited my rule. Should I have sat surrounded by the ghosts of lost loves, pondering how I might learn from them, or indulge my glory across the fabric of space-time? To Nathaniel, it may have been a quandary. To Kang, it was no choice at all. And so he says, to ground the kings of the past to dust. Arthur, most of all, his cries were not those of a hero, but of a child who thought destiny would not be swayed against him. The Cosmosian monarchs believed themselves safe in their quantum dimension. I showed them the error of their ways, then blessed their endless cities by reforging them as factories for my time-spanning war machine. Over and over and over again, it's the exact same way. He meets Immortus, he defeats Immortus. He meets the Skrulls, he defeats the Skrulls. The Badoon, the Shi'ar, literally the entire universe is conquered by Kang. That Nathaniel, and that's what's so crazy here, that where Kang, like the Kang that initially appeared, saw love as weakness, Nathaniel sees it as strength. Not in the sense that it's his love for Ravonna Renslayer that makes him the person that he wants to become, but ultimately it was the losing of love of Ravonna Renslayer that drove him to become the person that he is. And so ultimately he says, once all of this was said and done, at the end of the day, I still never found anything. I still couldn't feel anything. I had conquered the entirety of the universe, and yet something was still missing from my life. Something that I felt like I needed, that I wanted, I simply just couldn't find anymore. And so what he does is he travels back to Earth after hearing that there is a single kingdom out there that remains unconquered by his forces. And so ultimately when he arrives here, that he ends up finding that this is the last free kingdom that's ruled by Ravonna Renslayer. Now, it's been quite some time since the Ravonna Renslayer he immediately met again. And in fact, he even comments on that. He was like, okay, it was her. It was Ravonna Renslayer yet again, right? A different face, but those same eyes. And so what this seems to hit at is that Ravonna Renslayer is in a lot of ways a concept, an ideology. I mean, she is a person, but the big question that has to be asked here, which we'll actually find out really in the next video, is how it is that Ravonna Renslayer keeps reappearing as different people in the time stream, right? How is it that in the days of ancient Egypt she had appeared, albeit not necessarily as the Ravonna Renslayer that we're familiar with? She shows up in the modern, or really about 100 years ago in the 40th century, and then she shows up again here. And each time she seemingly looks different. How does that happen? But the reality here is that when he does appear to Ravonna Renslayer, the first thing he wants to do is win her heart, right? The first thing he wants is to have his girl back. But the reality here is she sees him as a conqueror. She doesn't see him as a person she could love. She sees him as a person that she absolutely hates. And so what he realizes is that the only way to get Ravonna Renslayer, the only way to get her love, is to show her who he really is. Because the reality here, and this is one of the best things about this story, Kang the Conqueror, as you see him here, he's not genuinely that guy, right? Nathaniel is not genuinely some warlord that wants to conquer all of existence for no other reason than the fact that it feeds his ego. What he wants is to find some measure of meaning out there. What he's doing here by conquering everything is filling the hole in his heart that was left by not having Ravonna Renslayer. But who he is at his core is a genuinely great person, right? Is a genuinely good guy. And that's when he realizes, I have to actually show her who I am in order for her to truly love me. And that's what he starts doing, right? That's literally what he starts doing, is he starts basically operating as effectively a hero, right? That he calls off the attack on her kingdom, and then he frees her kingdom and says, like, you do your thing, right? Like, your kingdom is totally, like, we are hands off. Not only that, he basically allies himself as heroes, right? The ones that were essentially time displaced, but he acts as heroes. All the while, his general, right, Boltag, is plotting against him. And so there comes a point where, in reality, the idea of Ravonna Renslayer, as she appears here being killed, does happen at the hands of Boltag, right? It does happen as him, who ultimately does shoot her. And so basically taking him out as the traitor saves the life, or seems to save the life, of Ravonna Renslayer. And so ultimately, he wins her heart, right? He finally gets Ravonna Renslayer's love. And in that moment, Boltag shoots her, right? In the moment when he basically reveals his role as a traitor before Kang can act, Ravonna Renslayer is killed. And so it's one of the coolest moments here, right? He says, I prepare to end Boltag, as Kang never had, but for a moment, I stay my hand, for I have fallen in love, and it has not conquered me. It is my mercy she has grown to love. I win, and time lasts. Because once she's dead and gone, it's the thing where she says, maybe it was just never meant to be. Maybe we were just never meant to be together. And Kang basically almost breaks on this personal level, right? The one chance he had to finally have Ravonna Renslayer, the closest he ever got to having the woman of his dreams, and it's yanked away. It's pulled away, because in reality, Kang can never have Ravonna Renslayer, right? It's the torment of him as a person. He will never get Ravonna. He will never be in love with Ravonna. He will never have the life he wants with Ravonna. That's never going to happen. And so what he does, and this basically goes into how it is that Renslayer appears across the time stream, and he says, and so it was then that I devised a new escape, my love, one the old man could never have accomplished, one that I know I already will. He spent the next 50 years mourning you when you initially died. He says in his time, right, Kang's time, he spent the next 50 years mourning you, trying to bring you, his Ravonna, back. But I have seen your face in the distant past, and I have seen your face only 100 years ago, and I see you here now. And where he was told never love, he says, I have already seen the ripples in the waters of time, but I remained so ignorant as to the impact that caused them. But I know now. What else could it be? I am the impact, and I shall shatter time for you. Awake, Ravonna, awake 1,000 times, and be saved by my final conquest. And so the goal of Kang the Conqueror is to quite literally shoot Ravonna Renslayer's essence into the time stream and basically use that as a way to find a reality where he can have Ravonna Renslayer back. So it's really cool, right? Again, it's as much a retelling as keeping components of the original origin of Kang intact. I mean, I would surmise all this is being done because of Kang in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it's really cool. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.